Thank you for downloading this edition of Start the Week, presented by me, Sue McGregor. Hello. Today we're going to consider nothing less than the future of our planet in the light of what at least one respected scientist calls the unprecedented planetary emergency that we've created. He's Stephen Emmett, whose new book, 10 Billion, that was also the name of the play in which he starred a year ago at the Royal Court Theatre in London. Not many scientists can say that. Anyway, his new book conveys a deeply pessimistic message about population growth, and Stephen himself leads an extensive scientific research programme at Cambridge University. Also with me is a scientist who takes a very different view, Danny Dorling, Professor of Geography at Sheffield University. Be an optimist, he advises us. Don't listen to what he calls the aggressive pessimists. His own book is encouragingly called Population 10 Billion, The Coming Demographic Crisis and How to Survive It. And here too with me is the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen. His latest book, An Uncertain Glory, is about the challenges faced by his own country, India, which will soon overtake China as the world's most populous. And Jill Rutter from the Institute for Government, an independent body promoting more effective government. With a background in sustainable development, Jill has her own views on how governments deal or don't deal with crises, current and to come. But let's start with Stephen Emmett. Stephen, your book, 10 Billion, at the end of it, you say, we cannot avoid global catastrophe. You think we've had it. You use rather stronger language, which I'd better not use at this hour of the day. Why are you so pessimistic?
But before I answer that question, I should just say one thing, which is that I am my lab at Microsoft in Cambridge, not at the Cambridge University, sorry. I'm pessimistic for the following reasons, and it's probably best to put it into this kind of context. We are the drivers of almost every global problem that we face, such as climate change, land degradation, loss of biodiversity, water stress. And as we continue to grow towards 10 billion, possibly more, every one of these problems is set to get worse, much worse. For example, as we continue to grow and more of us continue to want to consume the way in which we around this table consume, demand for food is set to at least double, possibly treble by the end of this century. Demand for water is set to at least double, possibly treble by the end of this century, and demand for energy is set to at least double, possibly treble by the end of this century.
And you remind us of the figures, which are quite frightening in a way, the accelerating rate of population growth. 1 billion people on the world in 1820, 7 billion now, 10 or more billion by the end of the century. How has it accelerated so fast?
Well, as Danny will no doubt point out, the rate at which population is increasing is declining, but it's still going up in terms of absolute numbers, going up rapidly. And you know, I suppose one thing that Danny and I may or may not agree on is that it's less the numbers, but more the way in which we live, and that's the key.
You mean our aspirational living?
Well, there's several billion of us on the planet who have aspirations to live how Europeans and Americans consume, and the way in which Europeans and Americans largely consume is causing enormous problems. But I think one of the reasons why I'm pessimistic at the end of the book is that probably one of the most important things is not just the increase in population from 7 billion to 10 billion, and coupled with that with the way in which an increasing number of those 10 billion will wish to consume. It's the fact that I suppose I would characterise it like this: is the failure of us, and in particular the failure of governments, to actually do anything about it.
Well, the trouble is that 10 billion people in the lifetime of our grandchildren, perhaps put it that way, seems still a long way away, and it's really hard to get worried unless you're a member of the Green Movement, and many millions are, about that, isn't it? I mean, I'm not saying I approve of that view, but it is hard to get people to bother about something that's going to happen when they're not around.
I agree. It's incredibly hard. That's why I'm not entirely certain what the solution is going to be. I mean, whether it involves legislation from governments who probably now for the future, but is an interesting question. politicians do like to be elected, and politicians being elected in this, it seems highly unlikely because it would require very unpopular measures to actually control some of the problems that we're heading for.
Well, we'll come back to that very important question. But Danny Dorling, I know that you disagree with quite a lot of what Stephen says, but you do agree that there is a slight deceleration in the population growth. But you don't disagree about 10 billion in the year 2100?
I agree with what Stephen says about how we behave. This is crucial. Population is now rising at a very high rate. But in fact, the deceleration began way back in 1971. It's like a juggernaut, where the brakes were applied slightly in 1971. In 1990, we hit peak baby in the world. We're currently about peak 18-year-old, but it's going to carry on rising.
When you say peak baby, what does that mean?
Oh, more babies were born in 1990 than at any point before or after. And so we often talk about a world that's ageing. We don't talk about the declining numbers of young people, which is all good news. The big problem is not the numbers of people. The numbers of people is going down quite rapidly, and we may not get to 10 billion.
Well, not from those figures that we've just heard.
A large part of the reason why our numbers will increase is that more of us will be around for longer. So it's not more new people. And when you're talking about worrying about it, this isn't our grandchildren. It's our children. Odds on, if you believe the ONS life expectancy figures, one of my children will probably live to be around when we hit 10 billion. So this is really approaching quite rapidly. But we do need to understand it's not because of our birth rates are now falling. This is great news and have been falling for 40 years.
But we're all living longer.
We're all going to live longer, and that means that at any one time there's going to be more of us about. The question is, can we live longer and not consume as much? And that's the hardest question.
Well, that's something that must have concerned you, Amartya Sen. The United Nations predicts that India's population will surpass China's quite soon, in the next 15 years or so, to just under 1.5 billion people. As an economist, this must be of concern to you.
Would have been concerned if the UN demographic predictions had been better in the past than they have been. So I think those numbers, they keep on revising these numbers quickly. Actually, Danny Dorling goes through that a bit, how quickly they have revised, and they have a maximum scenario, they have a minimum scenario.
But they're not revising them severely downwards.
Well, they have in the past. They have underestimated the population, the birth rate decline of which Danny was speaking. You see, I think the thing to recognize that 6 of the Indian 18 states already have below replacement population. I think what is important, actually, I am concerned, like Stephen is, with the nature of the problem, that there could be, if there's a large number of people, and there is an aspirational issue, and we might come back to that a bit later, then there could be, if we do get to 10 billion or more, there could be a genuine issue, genuine problem. But I think what it overlooks is that there is the factors that pull population goes down, the birth rate down, that is the birth rather than population goes because of people living longer. It's been a subject of debate right from the time of Malthus and Condorcet in the 18th century. Malthus took the thesis from Condorcet, who was worried about overpopulation.
Well, Malthus thought we were done for in his time.
He thought with 1 billion is more than the Earth could bear. That scenario we visited again and again. But I think that's not my concern so much here. It's just that Malthus thought that education and healthcare did not have an impact of reducing population birth rate, whereas Condorcet's position was exactly the opposite. And he was one of the first to emphasize the importance of women's education. Just to give an example, the education of women and the women having gainful activity, having a bigger voice, immediately reduces the fertility rate. For example, Bangladesh has gone from 7 per children to 2.2.
We'll come to that in a minute. So I take it that you would count yourself among the optimists.
I count myself. You see, neither optimist or pessimist assume that our policies and policy thinking doesn't make a difference. If we have reason to be optimist if we are intelligently do right things.
Right. When doing the right thing is where I come to Jill Rutter now. We'll talk to Amartya later about India's specific problems in all of these areas. But Jill, Stephen's conclusion that we've had it. Are you somebody who thinks that governments can make a difference? I mean, isn't this an indictment of the cleverness of politicians to be able to lead us out of these sloughs of despond?
I think there's inevitably quite a big collective action problem. One of the problems with the conversations we're having about 10 billion is it's essentially a global problem. And as we've seen in the prolonged attempts to get a success of the Kyoto Treaty, actually that sort of collective action problem...
That was 16 years ago.
16 years ago, and you might say that the sort of agreement you can get governments to sign up to is a sort of agreement that actually doesn't deliver very much. So people, I think, were probably over-seduced by the success of the Montreal Protocol in phasing out CFCs, which is actually a relatively easy thing to do. So people assumed it would be relatively easy to get global agreement to reduce carbon emissions. I think there's now an increasing number of people say, actually, we may be banging our head on a brick wall on that one. It might be better to do something else, whether it's to go for an agreement between sort of leading countries and then look at sort of carbon adjustment taxes and things like that. That maybe that model of universal global agreement with ever more nations being added to the UN really isn't that feasible. So I think there's
ever more nations being added to the European Union. New one today.
Croatia coming in today. Whatever, but I think there's sort of interesting differences because quite a lot of these policies then play out at domestic level, and that's where you get the question about being elected. And quite noticeable that the UK, to its credit, took the lead in 2007, being the first country to introduce legislated carbon targets. Now, whether you think the government's going to meet them or not is a different issue, but that was done with an amazing degree of cross-party consensus. Only 3 people in the House of Commons voted against the climate change bill was introduced. And that was the first attempt to really set a bit of a long-term trajectory for the UK to deal with something. It was on the assumption that leadership would then translate into action in Copenhagen, which we saw then didn't happen, which is perhaps a reason to veer slightly more towards Stephen's end of the dimension. But anyway.
All right, Jill. Well, I'm going to come back to you and talk to you about what government priorities in this country are in terms of this big problem. But let me move across and back to Danny Dorling. Danny, your book, Population 10 Billion, The Coming Demographic Crisis and How to Survive It, the very title tells us that you are an optimist about this, maybe even an aggressive optimist, or a rational one anyway.
No. I'm not rational optimists are people who think that technology will solve our problems.
And you don't?
I describe myself as a possibilist. That means it is possible that we will be okay. The phrase comes from Hans Rosling, who created Gapminder.
You have to remind us what that was.
Gapminder is this program that's available for free on the web that lets you see how the world is changing. And Hans is the person who coined the phrase peak baby for 1990.
Oh, I see. Will that make us feel more optimistic or pessimistic if we constantly look at this website?
It would help a lot, I think, and look at what Hans is saying. It's not that I'm saying that we will be okay. It's that if we think that there is almost no chance that we'll be okay, then it's very hard to say to people they should bother about doing anything. I think there's very good news on population numbers. There isn't yet much good news on consumption. However, we do see some forms of consumption reducing. Even in this country, before the crash, the amount of stuff that we were buying by weight was reducing up until 2005 in everything apart from clothes. People were still convincing us to buy more clothes than we possibly needed, more clothes than we could ever wear.
And somebody's actually weighed all the clothes we bought before and after.
Yes, they work it out. And the difficulty are things like advertisers. Advertisers are encouraging people around the world to buy more and more things. These are huge problems, but our actual numbers are going down. What we've got to do is to stop the people who are trying to get us to buy more from getting us to buy more.
So you seem to hold out great hope that we will, in the rich West, change our behaviour.
We may change our behaviour. Our behaviour may already be changing. I don't think this will necessarily come from combined government action. It may simply come because if you look at the period since the rate of growth began to reduce, economies haven't been able to cope with it. Our economic way of being has relied on there being ever more people and ever expanding markets so you can make a profit selling things.
So there's no incentive for the big corporations to stop doing what they're doing?
Well, but if they look at the population numbers, they can realise that their markets are going to be shrinking for young people from now ever onwards. So trying to sell more and more and more, you're more likely to fail. You need to be clever if you're a corporation and not simply try to persuade people to buy more of your products, but to buy things they actually really need less frequently and wear them out till they're finished.
But just one thought to add to that, Danny. If you do, and it's a big if, persuade people in the West to buy less and consume less, at the same time, aspirational people in the developing world are wanting to earn more, buy more, consume more. Aren't they going to more than make up for the difference?
This is the worry, but if you look at somewhere like Japan, which is well ahead of this, but still, until recently, was increasing in population, for the last 20 years, every year, the number of cars bought in Japan has gone down. Japan is a far better model in Tokyo than London if you want to see a lower consumption society. But we do need, above all else, people in the West to consume less, and we need our politicians to stop talking about winning the global race. That's a global race to planetary destruction. And, you know, as soon as you hear the phrase winning the global race, you need to think idiot, I think.
Well, Stephen Emmett, here's an intelligent fellow academic, if you like, of yours, using the broader spectrum, saying it's going to be all right. People can change their behaviour, and after all, it's only people living older that's going to living to be much older, or the older population getting much bigger, that's going to be the problem. It's not sort of acres and acres of new babies.
Well, I'm not sure I share Danny's optimism in this. I mean, even in the, let's say, more well-informed Europe and the US, who have nearly everybody, I mean, virtually no one can be unfamiliar with some of these problems, certainly not climate change and overconsumption. And if there is evidence of a reduction in consumption in the UK, I think Danny was talking about, it's certainly not visible outside Primark. And Danny
which is a very inexpensive shop.
Yes. And when we think about the amount of water that goes into producing cotton, for example, and that water, that's water that we don't pay for. It's water that comes from some other country. It might be Bangladesh or Tunisia, we also have to remember. I mean, Dan is talking about a reduction in, for example, consumption of cars in Japan. And every motor manufacturing sort of organisation is predicting that there will be at least 2.5, possibly 4 billion more cars produced over the next 50 years.
Yes, you have some fascinating figures in your book about how many litres of water it costs to produce a car and how many litres of water it costs to produce a litre of water in a bottle. Can you give us some of those?
Well, I mean, I think some, for example, the most ironic one is it takes about at least 4 litres of water to produce a 1 litre plastic bottle of water. And I think in the UK alone, we consumed and disposed of about 9 billion plastic bottles of water. I mean, that's absolute criminal activity, to be honest.
And a car?
Well,
a great deal more.
It's less an issue of water, apart from,
as
for example,
energy.
It's just extracting things out of the ground, transporting it all around the planet in very polluting ships. Whether it's the lead in the
atmosphere,
lead in the battery, or right.
Yes, Amartya, let me bring you in here. We'll talk specifically, as I said, about India later on. Yes. But the point I made about as the West, if it does, begins to consume less and the developing world more, this is not going to help the problem. What's your view on that?
Well, I think it's a great mistake. I'm not accusing my colleagues of making the mistake of thinking abstractly in terms of consumption. We get consumer goods to do something, have living standards. For example, Adam Smith discussed already in 1776 the reason why you can't appear in public without shame if you don't have as much clothing as others do, is because what you're seeking is not to have as much clothing as others do, a kind of relative advantage, but the absolute ability to communicate with people.
But the ability of the third world, the developing world now, to consume is looking to be enormous and increasing.
Yes, but it depends on. This is where the issue of leadership is important. I think if it goes in the direction of individual cars rather than public transport, if it goes in the direction of commodities rather than expanding education, healthcare, none of which are as much absorbing in terms of environmental resources, then there is a problem. But you have to bear in mind education, healthcare, extremely labor-intensive work. And in general, the kind of living standard that you can get everywhere in the world, you see the service sector, which is the labor sector ultimately, is a higher and higher proportion. So it's not so much that there's a basket of commodities that has to continuously go on increasing at that rate. So one has to think in terms of the aspiration. That question came up. I think Stephen raised that. But I think the aspiration is about living standard, quality of life, which is not the same thing as how many pounds of commodities you carry into home.
It's in a way, it's how many cars you own, how many mobile phones you have, and how many televisions.
The mobile phones is a different thing, because I think that has made a big difference to the life of ordinary people.
Certainly, and in Africa particularly.
Well, Africa and everywhere, China, India, and so on. But I think generally, I would think that one could be more pessimistic if one went only by a kind of homogeneous idea of consumption, rather than what people are seeking, good quality of life.
Let's return with Jill Rutter of the Institute for Government to the role of politicians here, Jill. I mean, all governments, particularly ours, have science advisors, scientific advisors, but politicians are the ones who bring policies into reality, or not, as the case may be. How important do you think is this demographic crisis to our politicians in this country?
Well, I think there are two dimensions of demographic crisis, one of which is what is going on globally and the impacts that's going to have, where they need to address that globally. And some of the things that Amartya Sen has been talking about girls' education, for instance, is very big emphasis in our aid programme, because people recognise that that's sort of very important instrumental change.
And we have now a sort of ring-fenced aid programme.
We've ring-fenced aid. The figures for changes since 2010 in departmental budgets are really extraordinarily striking about what's happening to the Department for International Development. So that's one set of issues. There's the UK's role in negotiating international agreements, which is another one. Then there's the sort of domestic policies of actually what are you going to pursue. There, I think one of the things that argues with Danny rather than Stephen is a lot of research says, actually, if you just scare people, we tried that when we were talking about climate change, we tried scaring people. Government did that relatively successfully on AIDS. They then tried that again on climate change. If you just scare people, then they turn off. So that's not a very positive way of engaging people. But actually,
when did they last scare us, Jill? I don't remember being scared by.
We tried to do some we never had the big enough budget. So there are two strategies that you adopt on climate change. One of which is to scare people. And try that. DEFRA never had quite a big enough budget to scare people properly, but if you watch some very obscure channels, you could watch DEFRA trying to scare people about carbon emissions.
And you were part of DEFRA?
That was when I was part of the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, when it had responsibility for climate change before the creation of the Department of Energy and Climate Change. So there's a bit of attempts to say, actually, this is the dimension of the problem. This is what it's going to look like. But the other thing that governments try and do, which I think is equally misguided, is to try and say it's all really quite easy. So the government ran a campaign before I joined DEFRA called Are You Doing Your Bit?, which suggested that you could indeed do something about climate change if you filled your kettle with slightly less water, or if
you shared a bath.
Or if you shared a bath. Shared a bath, I think, was more Patrick Jenkins in the 1970s to deal with the power cuts. Maybe we'll see that again if we have the forecast power cuts from 2015 onwards. So, and that gave people the impression that actually just throwing away a couple of aluminium cans was enough to do that. And we would do polling, which would say, yes, I'm doing my bit for the environment, I'm recycling, things like that. And we all know it's much more fundamental. The things that people were resistant to were the things that people most like doing. So when you started to interfere in people's decisions about driving or flying, then you are reaching points of resistance. We've had a lot of resistance to the idea of stealth taxes, green taxes. People are very suspicious about that. And one of the things that I think you also have to remember is that we live in an age when trust in politicians is extremely low. I mean, if you look at the veracity index that Ipsos Mori produce, trust in politicians is usually below 20%. They're nestling at the bottom with estate agents and sundry other people whom we wouldn't be taking very many lifestyle choices from. So that's part of the context. But you also see some quite considerable behaviour changes on the other side of the ledger. I mean, fuel use has dropped quite markedly in a lot of countries since the 2008 price shocks. So you saw that in the 1970s, that fuel efficiency in the US went tremendously. They then completely lost the plot and moved over to sort of SUV land. But as prices go up, people do adapt their behaviour, and that's one way of looking at it. So we have seen some very substantial behaviour changes in a number of areas which have been politically acceptable.
Well, but let me put a very extreme view to you. Governments in the West would hesitate to say, have fewer children. Look what's going to happen to your children and your grandchildren at the end of this century. But it has been done. I mean, China with its one-child policy until recently, and India under Mrs. Gandhi, much I think I'm right in saying at one point, there was, quote, enforced sterilisation.
Yeah, come on that.
Yes, come in on that.
Yeah. I think that's been totally counterproductive. You see, the Chinese have had a big reduction in birth rate. But it's the two main determinants. Demographic research going out quite sharply. Across countries, within districts in India, we've done it everywhere. The two factors that reduces fertility rate are women's education and women's gainful employment. Anything that increases the voice of young women, whose lives are the ones most battered by over-frequent bearing and rearing of children, reduces fertility rate. Now, if you take those factors and put it against China, China has made big progress in the good things. And you find the Chinese fertility rate today bang on the line. I think basically the one-child policy gave it very little bump. You see, the sad thing about the good thing that China does doesn't get enough attention. The bad thing it does, namely forcing people going against liberty, kind of really authoritarianism at its worst on the one-child policy, did not have any of those results. And even you said about India, if you look at them, many of the Indian states, like Kerala, which have the same fertility rate as China, these are the ones which never did compulsory. Yeah. The northern states which did have still, rather than 1.7 in Kerala, is 3.2, 3.5. I think
so Kerala has had a sort of natural
Kerala,
mean
Tamil
amount of
Nadu, Himachal Pradesh, all these are below replacement now. Now, the important thing to recognize is Jill was absolutely right. The important issue is how to do it. But how not to do it is extremely important.
Yes.
And ordering people around is not only bad from a liberty point of view, but utterly counterproductive.
But, Danny Dorling, is there a role for ordering people around from government?
No, it doesn't. It hasn't worked very well.
It did work with smoking.
Well, we still have very high rates of smoking amongst poorer people. The smoking ban helps middle-class people not have to breathe in smoke when they less and less frequently go to the pub. But in general, whenever government has tried to force people to do things, it's been counterproductive. But what government can do is help point out that if you take Stephen's bottles of water, the best way to increase your living standard when it comes to water is to carry a bottle around and refill it when you want more water. It actually makes you feel better, and you don't drink as much sticky stuff with sugar in it.
And tap water tastes a bit better than it used to.
Yeah, and government can certainly help with these kind of things, where there are some easy wins, but a lot of it's much harder. But whenever there's been imposition, it tends to have been counterproductive. And one of the biggest factors that's helped has been people winning rights themselves. So this emancipation of women that's occurred around the globe has probably been the driving force for the slowdown in population, and it wasn't government policy to emancipate women over the course of most of the last century.
Yeah. Stephen Emmett, do you feel a little bit better about things now? I mean, the examples we've been given are quite compelling, aren't they? In terms of population growth.
In fact, I don't know where to start.
You have the floor.
So, well, take the issue of the positive outcome of reducing fertility rates. Now, whether it's enforced as in China or whether it's through education, as we've seen in a number of countries, although not that many, Amitai gave some examples. You look at China, which has had a really quite extreme policy. And yet its carbon emissions, its pollution, its consumption has gone through the roof. So just reducing fertility rates does not guarantee reducing consumption. On the issue of Jill's point about governments, about I take Jill's point about scaring people. It, often doesn't work, although it did. Arguably, it did with AIDS, at least in some sections of the population. And now, of course, we've gone to the other extreme with this nudge.
This is Malcolm Gladwell's.
Right, which I might
don't frighten the horses, just nudge people into doing something.
Which I think, I think we're well beyond the problems that we face are well beyond anything that nudge might achieve. I do just.
Well, there's a whole department for nudge.
Indeed, I think there's some sort of number 10 department.
I think there are about 10 people working at the centre of government on nudge.
And that's actually, probably 10 too many.
Actually, I don't agree. I don't agree on nudge because I think you can see nudge as an alternative to regulation, taxation and all the other things that are in the government's toolkit, all of which government needs to use, all of which government used to reduce smoking rates, all of which governments need to use. Or you can see nudge as actually improving the efficiency of all those instruments by bringing a bit more thinking to bear on how do you design policies sensibly. Otherwise, just leave it to chance. And actually, I think if you see that as part of what the Behavioural Insights team are trying to do, I think that's quite sensible. It's also actually trying to understand what are some of the real barriers to people doing things, which I think quite interesting. We have, I think, realised that just the sort of simple price mechanism, the very rational ways we go about things don't always work. One of the interesting things they did on getting people to insulate lofts, very cheap win on energy efficiency, was actually send some people in to clear out people's lofts and then people were prepared to insulate because people actually just couldn't be bothered to do that. So it's small, it may be at the margin, but actually I don't think it's worth deriding, actually. I think it's a useful addition to the toolkit.
Do continue, Stephen, if you would, because if I may insert a question just to guide the conversation. I think that in the developing world, is there... I wonder if you know the answer to this. Is there a feeling that Armageddon is approaching in the life of people's children and grandchildren? Or is the aspirational aspect of a better life totally overwhelming that?
Well, I suppose it depends on who you talk to, but I don't get a sense that the scale and the nature of the problems that we face are fully or even well appreciated. And to take Jill's point, I mean, I suppose I was being a little bit ungracious about the nudge unit, but the reason why I was is because the scale and the nature of the problems that we face are so immense that nudge-like efforts to, wee in the shower or sort of share a bath with someone or just even reduce our consumption of tin cans or something is simply not going to do it. And a good example is, about 30% to 40% of all greenhouse gases is produced by agriculture. And food production is going to at least double, probably triple this century.
And we've already got, 40% of our land under agriculture?
Right. And so trying to reduce at the margins in posh countries or in rich countries like this it's overwhelmed by the fact that agriculture is increasing sharply, obviously, to be able to feed 7 billion and soon 9 billion and soon 10 billion. And greenhouse gases simply do not have geopolitical boundaries.
So if you could very briefly shout very loudly one message at our government, our British government, what would it be? What should they concentrate on?
Action and not words.
Well, action in which department?
Well, I think in every department of Energy, Department of Transport, just every single department.
Right, OK, fair enough. Let me move back to Amartya now. A failure of government, I think, either nudging or compelling, is at the heart of your book, An Uncertain Glory, about modern India. Okay. Modern India's thought of, isn't it, Amartya, mostly as a success story. It's the world's largest democracy. It's a superpower in the making. It's got a booming economy, bit of a dip recently. But all the same, it's booming and there's a hugely rising middle class. And yet you say that India has failed to capitalise on this and raise even the most basic standards for the poor. Worst in healthcare. That's a pretty big indictment of government, isn't it?
I hope it is. The purpose of it is to have a discussion on that. India is a democracy, you're right. There are lots of successes. Human rights is a good relative success compared with other countries. India sells more. The Indians buy more newspaper than any other nation on earth by a considerable margin. There are all kinds of things, but the media discussion has been quite limited and very strongly influenced by the powerful middle classes. kind of class I come from. Now, I think the result of it is that some of the extent of the terrible lives of the relatively uneducated, often completely uneducated, bad healthcare people, it doesn't get at all the attention. Now that's the thing to change. I think the diagnosis is the problem, but then the question how to do it. Now, in the case of India, it's not. In the case of China, where I was also involved because I was connected with Peking University, with they're taking more health seriously, which they didn't for a while in the 80s. Now, I think there you have to convince the top layers. In India, even if you convince the Prime Minister, that would need not do it because you have to win an election. So then you have to get it in the public domain.
That applies all over the world, doesn't it?
To the democratic countries. That's the point I'm making. It wouldn't apply in China in quite the same way. But in the case of India, like in Britain, it is the public have to look at. So my book is a joint book with Andres, is addressed to the public to change the nature of the public dialogue.
I mean, it's a tremendous bit of irony that you point out in your book that the worst failure of the Indian government is in healthcare, and yet India is the world's largest producer of generic medicines, for instance.
Indeed so.
There's no lack of skill, it's simply a lack of application.
Well, it's a clear thinking. I think the question of nudge came up. My position on this is that there's some subject where you don't need much nudge. And I would say if we come back, and I do want to talk a little about my own book rather than Stephen, but I don't think you need so much nudge to reduce the size of the family with educated women and an independent voice of women. That you don't. What you do need is the government to have a more organized healthcare, the nature of the consumption pattern as people getting richer, not going in the direction of individual cars, and so on. These are subjects on which the issue of nudge may come in. But I think the basic issue of education and healthcare, cutting down on the worries that Stephen is really worried about, seems to me doesn't even require a nudge. It basically requires a thing to do it. And the question of DFID come up earlier, and I must say I've seen it on ground. And I think the record of DFID is excellent in this. DFID and some of the NGOs like Oxfam, with which I used to be, I am associated still, and so on. So I think that the British thinking on this, which wasn't in this context a nudge form, but is to emphasize certain critical things of which education and healthcare were very central.
Quite a lot of people listening, and I ask you if you wouldn't mind, Amartya, to answer this question just briefly, would think, why don't the millions of poor people in India rise up and say, this is unfair on us, the way we're treated?
Well, this is one of the problems of democracy. It depends much on how information is disseminated and discussed. Why is it that the large number of people without health care in America did not rise up? Why wasn't it a more vote-getting thing? Why did democracy fail there? Why did the Americans get carried away on the idea that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction? I think there is no substitute. It's not nudge to have education, to media discussion, and an enlightened society.
Jill Rutter, you're dying to come in.
I just thought there was one thing that crossed all three of these books, which was the importance of having a much more sophisticated discussion about the indicators we use of government performance. At the moment, we're all riveted every quarter about whether GDP, total GDP has changed by 0.1, whatever.
Whether we're getting a bit wealthier or not.
It's always back revised anyway. We don't even look at GDP per capita or what we suggest in a report that we did at the Institute for Government recently with the LSE, median GDP per capita, which at least would capture some of the distributional things. Because I think one of the things that comes out very strongly in Danny's book is the increasing inequalities across a lot of developed countries. That's an issue here, issue in India. And also in Stephen's, capturing those environmental indicators, the social progress indicators, alongside just looking at GDP.
So there we are. We're almost at the end of our programme and all sorts of issues, but I don't sense any agreement between Danny and Stephen yet. But Danny, behaviour change, governments, as Jill has pointed out, and indeed as Amartya has pointed out, are interested in the next election and not giving the bad news. you're still an optimist about our population
I'm
and
still an
our
optimist about
ability to
people,
deal with it.
not necessarily governments. I mean, if Stephen says governments need to do action, one of the key things governments could do is not do things that are going to make things worse that people aren't calling for. A classic example right now would be fracking, which across most of Europe is opposed. But
Well,
our
that's
government,
drilling down through
our government and a
rock
few
for
business
oil.
people want to release enormous amounts of carbon into the air and are scaring us that we're going to get power cuts, rather than working out how we reduce our electricity consumption and don't release all this carbon. The first government action that governments could do would be to not make things worse, rather than looking at the rest of the population.
In terms of population, that might be difficult in the rest of the world. Stephen Emmett, any persuasive arguments counter to your own that you've taken on board today? Is it better to change behaviour naturally or to legislate? Or are we doomed?
I think it would require both legislation and changing individual behaviour. And the problem is that I think I'm pessimistic about the outcome because I simply don't think that we will do so.
Why?
Because all the evidence points to the fact that we've known about these problems for 20 years and we are not doing so. And there are billions of people who want, in developing countries, who want to live like us. And there's another 3 billion that are yet to be born who will inevitably, a substantial proportion of them, also want to consume irresponsibly.
Well, at this point, we end on a slightly pessimistic note. We must almost say goodbye. Thank you, big thank you to all my guests. First of all, Jill Rutter from the Institute for Government, then Danny Dorling, whose book Population 10 Billion, The Coming Demographic Crisis and How to Survive It is out now. Amartya Sen's An Uncertain Glory about India, co-authored with Jean Drèze, is published this month, as is Stephen Emmett's 10 Billion. And that's it for Start the Week until the autumn, back on the 16th of September. Till then, may you have plenty of sunshine left in your summer. Thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.